Hi, this is Alex from PHP Academy and welcome to this CSS tutorial on 2D transformations. Now, in the first part of this tutorial I briefly discussed vendor prefixes and the vendor prefix that we're going to be using. I'm using Chrome, which uses WebKit to render its styles. So I'm going to be using the WebKit vendor prefix. Not too much about that in this video. In this video we're just going to be continuing and we're going to be starting to look at some of the functions that we can apply to this transform property, or in our case a WebKit transform. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to create an element on a page and we're going to apply various 2D transformations to this. Note that in different browsers you may get different results, but I'm going to show you a way with the Chrome Element Inspector, which if you haven't already seen is this here. We just right click on a page, inspect. We're going to be using this to change the values as we go, and that's going to make it a lot easier to see the result of our transformations and to quickly experiment with transformations as well. It's an extremely useful tool when you are developing, and it should be used wherever possible. So as I said, we're going to go ahead, we're going to create a basic element, we're going to style this, and then we're going to start to talk about the different transformation options that we have available. So I'm going to create a header, and I'm going to style this slightly different to how it's by default rendered. If we say this is a header, now by default we have an element, if I inspect this, that's spans the entire width of its parent container. That's because it's displayed as a block by default. You can see that just here. We're going to give it a predefined width, and this is going to make it a lot easier for us to apply transformations to it, because we do have a transformation origin. And the origin is the point in which it's transformed from, and we'll take a look at that property in a moment. If I was to say rotate this header from the center, let me just hover over it so you can see. The blue area is the area of the element, but you can clearly see it spans the entire width of the page. Now, if I was to say rotate from the center of here, and I wanted to rotate it, say, 10 degrees, and this was to come round 10 degrees, obviously it would have a massive point of origin, so we'd get this, basically the header would come all the way down here, and we don't want that, so we want to go ahead and give this a smaller width so we can rotate it sort of in this kind of area, if that makes sense. If it doesn't, go ahead and experiment with it, define the way I'm doing it and see how it works for yourself, but I'm going to be just styling this up first. So let's go over to our style sheet, which I have linked to this page, and let's go ahead and style our header 1. We'd probably normally give it a class because we wouldn't want to rotate every header we had on our page. Well, we might do, but in this case we're not going to. We're just going to, we're going to apply it to every H1. We're only going to be using one of them. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a width. As I said, I want to give it a predefined width. I'm going to say 260 pixels, and that shouldn't bring it down. Yep, that looks about right. I've got, a bit of extra space, and we're going to add some padding in this blue area as well. I'm also going to go ahead and give this a background of black, so hash 000. I'm going to give the font a color of white, so hash FFF, and I'm going to give it a padding of 10 pixels. So let's go back to our browser and see how this looks. Okay, that's not looking too bad at all. Let's just go ahead and reduce the width of this somewhat more. Maybe a tiny bit more. We'll go 220. That should be perfect. There we go. So we're going to be rotating and skewing and scaling and translating this this element, and we're going to be doing that using the transform property. And in the case of me using Chrome, or if you're using Safari, you would use WebKit transform. Okay, so the normal property would just be transform. That's not going to work in this case. We need to use the vendor prefix, which is fairly annoying. So if you want to support all browsers, you would have to use all of the browser prefixes, or the vendor prefixes, obviously at the time of recording this tutorial, but it may change in the future. So by the time you're watching this, it may have changed. Okay, so WebKit transform. Well, what do we do with this property? It's not, the same as other CSS properties. We can't say, 10 pixels or 10 degrees. We have to pass a function to this, and the reason being that WebKit transform can take a lot, several different functions or a combination of functions, which we'll look at a bit later. So, for example, I wanted to rotate it, which is the first thing we're going to look at. I would use the rotate function. So rotate, we pass it a value that we want to rotate by. Now we can use degrees, radians, but I'm going to be using degrees. It's just, the simplest one that we can use, and we're not going to spend time explaining radians. So we can use positive or negative values. Obviously, a positive value is going to rotate it a certain way, negative is going to go back, but we can, use the same. We can rotate it and have the same effect using negative as well. I'm sure if you understand degrees, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So, for example, if we wanted to rotate this header 1 10 degrees, we'd use WebKit transform. We would use the rotate function, and we would rotate this 10 degrees. So let's go ahead and see what's happened. Well, you can see that it has indeed rotated 10 degrees, and you'll see just down here as well, under our match CSS rules, we have got this value here, which we can now start to modify. And this is where it gets interesting. With such specific values, when you're passing specific values to things like this, it's really useful to be able to play around with them in the browser. And if you haven't used this before, this is a great way to play around with transformations. Firefox has a version of this which is called Firebug, which doesn't ship with the browser, but you can download that as an extension. So essentially all I'm going to do is click on here, and I'm going to press the up key, and you'll see that has changed to 11 degrees and 12 degrees, 13, 14, 15, and you can see that as I increase this value, I also change this element, and this element transforms. And you'll notice that I'm rotating and rotating and rotating, and I'm now going above 360 degrees, which is obviously a full turn. If I was to supply 360 degrees in there, we obviously get no transformation, simply because we've rotated it in a circle and it's back to where it started. 180 degrees will obviously flip this upside down, because it's 180 degrees. Minus 180 degrees will obviously do the same thing. And for example, minus, not 180, minus 15 degrees, we'll just do it the opposite way to 15, for example. And then, for example, we could have minus, let's say, 345 degrees. If we add 15 to this, we get 300, if we just, do a minus 360, we get the same thing. You get the idea. It's relatively simple concept. You just rotate it by a certain amount. So we could say, have all headers slightly rotated, play around. It's there to be played around with. So that's how we rotate elements using CSS transformations. Now, what happens to content around this area? For example, we might have a paragraph under something that we might want to, include under a header. Well, let's go ahead and get rid of. We'll get rid of this. We'll just stick a 0 in there for now. Let's go ahead and create a paragraph underneath this header, and we'll just say this is a paragraph. Now, usually in CSS, when we or HTML and CSS, when we have an element and we change this element, for example, let's go ahead and inspect this, and let's change the height of this element. So let's add a new property in here. We'll add the height as 200 pixels. Now you notice that the paragraph has moved down. It's relative to the header, so the sizing of the header will affect content around it, including this paragraph. But what happens when we apply a transformation to this header? What happens to the paragraph? Does it move away from the element? Because obviously if we transform this element around here, this paragraph's going to, you might think it would move out the way. Well, let's go ahead and test this out. Let's go ahead and say, let's rotate this 50 degrees. No, we'll do minus 50 degrees. Or minus 20, that's enough. Now you'll notice that the transformation hasn't actually affected the positioning of the paragraph. So the paragraph has stayed in exactly the same place, and it's almost like we're positioning this header with an absolute positioning. So for example, if we was to get rid of WebKit transform and we were to say position absolute, and then we were to say top 100 pixels, or top, say, 0 pixels, you'll see that it's overlapped the paragraph. So it's almost like we're using position absolute. However, it still stays relative to the paragraph. You know, it's not an absolutely positioned element. So you know, this is quite a tricky thing. You need to bear this in mind when you are creating or using transformations with regards to content around it, because the content's not going to move when you do so. So that's probably it for this part of the video. In the next part, we're going to look at transform origins. So we're going to look at where we can set this transformation from. At the moment, it's in the middle. It's in the very middle of this element. But we'll discuss that more in the next part.